The crystal chandelier above the rehearsal dinner table cast fractured light across my family's faces as my mother held up my engagement ring to the light, her lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer. "Is this from a gumball machine, sweetie?" she asked, loud enough for the entire private dining room to hear. "I mean, I know teachers don't make much, but surely Marcus could have afforded something with an actual diamond." The table fell silent except for my younger cousin Vanessa's poorly stifled giggle. I felt the heat rising to my cheeks, my hand instinctively curling into a fist to hide the simple silver band with its modest sapphire stone. But before I could formulate a response, a voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "That ring," came the deep, measured tone from the head of the table, "represents something your daughter values far more than carats or price tags. She's my partner in raising a son who understands that a person's worth isn't measured in dollars." Marcus's father, James Wellington, set down his wine glass with deliberate precision, his eyes meeting my mother's with an intensity that made her hand tremble slightly as she lowered my ring back to the tablecloth. "I'm Elena Morales, and this is the story of how I learned that the people who truly see your value aren't always the ones who share your blood." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the suburbs of Sacramento, California, I was raised in a household where appearance was everything. My mother, Patricia Morales, had built her entire identity around what the neighbors thought, what the country club members whispered, and what our extended family posted on social media. Our home on Magnolia Lane was a showcase property with its manicured lawn, imported Italian tile, and furniture that was beautiful but uncomfortable, much like the family dynamics it housed. My father, Robert, was a successful commercial real estate developer who provided abundantly in material ways but was largely absent emotionally, consumed by deals and golf tournaments and networking events that kept him away from home 6 days out of 7. I have one sibling, my younger sister Isabel, who seemed to have absorbed every one of my mother's values through some process of osmosis. By the time Isabel turned 16, she had already mastered the art of social climbing, dating only boys from the right families, wearing only brands that signaled status, and cultivating friendships that could advance her position in our community's invisible hierarchy. She was my mother's pride and joy, the daughter who reflected back all the values Patricia held dear. I was the anomaly, the daughter who disappointed simply by being herself. While Isabel spent her teenage years perfecting her appearance and social strategy, I buried myself in books and volunteer work at the local community center. I tutored kids from struggling families, organized food drives, and spent my summers working at a camp for children with disabilities. My mother viewed these activities with thinly veiled disdain, calling them charity work, in a tone that made charity sound like a character flaw rather than a virtue. The divergence in how my parents treated Isabel and me became glaringly obvious during our college years. Isabel was sent to USC with an unlimited budget for sorority fees, spring break trips, and a wardrobe that could have funded a small nonprofit for a year. When she decided to major in communications with a minor in finding a husband, as she jokingly but accurately described it, my parents beamed with approval. Meanwhile, I had chosen to attend Sacramento State University, a decision that prompted my mother to actually tear up at a family gathering, not from pride but from embarrassment that her daughter had chosen a state school over a prestigious private university. I paid for my own education through a combination of scholarships, student loans, and working 3 part-time jobs throughout my 4 years. I majored in education with a focus on special needs students, a career path that made my father visibly wince when I announced it at Sunday dinner. "You're smart enough to be a doctor or a lawyer," he said, his disappointment heavy in every word. "Why would you choose a profession where you'll struggle financially your entire life?" "Because some things matter more than money," I had replied, a statement that created a silence so profound I could hear the antique clock ticking in the hallway. After graduation, I took a position teaching at Lincoln Elementary, a Title I school in a lower-income neighborhood of Sacramento. My classroom was filled with 32nd graders, many from immigrant families, several with learning disabilities, and all of them hungry for someone to see their potential beneath their circumstances. I loved every chaotic, challenging, heartwarming moment of it. I decorated my classroom with colorful posters and learning stations built from recycled materials and my own money. I stayed late to tutor students who were falling behind. I attended their soccer games and dance recitals and family events when their own parents couldn't make it due to work schedules. My starting salary was $38,000 a year, barely enough to cover my studio apartment rent, student loan payments, and basic living expenses. I shopped at thrift stores, cooked simple meals at home, and found joy in free activities like hiking in the nearby foothills or reading books borrowed from the library. My life was modest by my family's standards, but it was authentic and purposeful in ways their luxury existence never seemed to be. Family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable as the contrast between Isabel's life and mine grew more pronounced. At my nephew's christening, Isabel arrived in a designer dress with her lawyer boyfriend in tow, announcing their upcoming trip to the Maldives. When asked about my life, I mentioned a successful reading program I had implemented that had helped 5 struggling students jump 2 grade levels. My mother patted my hand condescendingly and said, "That's nice, dear," before immediately turning back to Isabel to discuss wedding venues, despite the fact that Isabel wasn't even engaged yet. The subtle and not-so-subtle digs about my career choice, my modest lifestyle, and my lack of romantic prospects became a regular feature of family interactions. My Aunt Gloria once asked, loudly enough for everyone to hear, whether teachers even qualified for mortgages given their limited income. My cousin Brandon joked that I should have become a pharmaceutical rep like him if I wanted to afford the finer things in life. My mother frequently sighed about how she had hoped both her daughters would marry well, a statement that seemed to suggest my career made me unmarriageable. I developed a thick skin over the years, learning to let their comments slide off me without taking root. I reminded myself that their values weren't my values, that their definition of success wasn't the only valid definition. But I'd be lying if I said their constant judgment didn't sting. There were nights when I lay in my small apartment, listening to my neighbors through the thin walls, wondering if I was being foolish to choose purpose over profit, meaning over money. Then I met Marcus Wellington, and everything changed in ways I never could have anticipated. It was the first week of September, 3 years into my teaching career. I had stayed late after school to set up a new sensory corner for my students with autism when I heard a knock on my classroom door. Standing there was a tall man with warm brown eyes, slightly disheveled dark hair, and an expression of apologetic confusion. "I'm so sorry to bother you," he said, glancing at the clock which showed it was nearly 6 in the evening. "I'm Marcus Wellington, the new music teacher. I was told my classroom is somewhere in this wing, but I think I'm completely lost." He held up a crumpled map of the school and gave me a self-deprecating smile that immediately put me at ease. Apparently reading maps is not among my many talents. I laughed and introduced myself, then offered to show him to the music room which was just down the hall. As we walked, we fell into easy conversation. He had just moved to Sacramento from Portland, where he had been teaching middle school music for 5 years. Before that, he'd spent 2 years in the Peace Corps teaching music in rural Colombia. He spoke passionately about the power of music education, especially for underprivileged kids, and how he believed every child deserved access to artistic expression regardless of their economic circumstances. "Music isn't a luxury," he said as we reached his new classroom, his eyes lighting up with conviction. "It's a fundamental part of human experience." Some of my most talented students have been kids everyone else had written off as troublemakers or slow learners. Give them an instrument and suddenly they have a voice, a way to express things they can't put into words. I found myself nodding enthusiastically, recognizing in him the same passion for teaching that had drawn me to education despite my family's disapproval. We stood in the hallway talking for another hour, sharing stories about challenging students who had broken through, discussing educational philosophies, and discovering we had remarkably similar views on what truly mattered in life. That conversation became the first of many. Marcus and I started meeting for coffee before school, sitting together in the faculty lounge during lunch, and occasionally grabbing dinner after particularly long days. Our friendship deepened naturally, built on shared values, genuine respect, and an ease of communication I had never experienced with anyone else. He made me laugh with his dry humor and terrible puns. He listened intently when I talked about my students' progress or struggles. He never once made me feel like my career choice was anything less than noble. 3 months into our friendship, Marcus asked me to dinner at a small Ethiopian restaurant downtown, clarifying with endearing nervousness that he meant it as an actual date, not just colleagues grabbing food. I said yes immediately, my heart doing something fluttery and unfamiliar in my chest. That first official date lasted 5 hours, conversation flowing so naturally that we barely noticed the restaurant staff cleaning up around us. Our relationship progressed with the same ease and authenticity that had characterized our friendship. Marcus met me exactly where I was, never trying to change me or mold me into someone different. He thought my thrift store fashion finds were creative rather than cheap. He was genuinely interested in my work stories, asking follow-up questions about specific students weeks after I'd first mentioned them. He understood that my Friday nights were often spent grading papers or planning lessons, and rather than complaining, he'd show up with takeout and grade his own students' music theory assignments beside me. 6 months into our relationship, I finally worked up the courage to introduce him to my family at my mother's annual spring garden party. I'd been dreading it, knowing their judgment would be swift and harsh once they learned he was a teacher with a modest income. But Marcus insisted he wanted to meet the people who had raised me, claiming he could handle whatever they threw at him. The garden party was exactly as pretentious as I'd expected. My mother had hired an event coordinator, an ice sculptor, and a string quartet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Guests mingled on the lawn in their designer outfits, discussing their recent trips to Europe and their children's accomplishments in finance and medicine and law. I spotted Isabel immediately, draped in head-to-toe Chanel and showing off her new engagement ring, a massive diamond that had probably cost more than my annual salary. When I introduced Marcus to my parents, my mother's smile was so forced it looked painful. "A music teacher," she repeated, as if testing whether the words meant what she thought they meant. "How interesting. And where did you say you went to college?" "University of Oregon," Marcus replied cheerfully, either missing or deliberately ignoring the condescension in her tone. "Then I did my master's at Portland State while working full-time." My father's handshake was perfunctory, his attention already drifting toward a more important guest across the lawn. Isabel sized Marcus up in approximately 3 seconds, her expression making clear he didn't meet whatever criteria she used to evaluate human worth. Throughout the party, I watched my family and their social circle treat Marcus with polite dismissal, the kind of courtesy extended to service staff, acknowledged but not truly seen. Marcus handled it with grace and humor, seemingly unfazed by their obvious judgment. On the drive home, I apologized profusely for my family's behavior. "They're snobs," I said, tears of frustration and embarrassment threatening to spill over. "I'm sorry you had to experience that." He reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my palm. "Elena, I knew exactly what I was walking into. You've told me enough about your family that I wasn't surprised. And honestly, their opinion of me matters exactly 0%. The only opinion that matters is yours." He glanced at me with such tenderness that my breath caught. "Do you think less of me because I'm not wealthy or prestigious?" "Of course not," I said immediately. "That's not what makes someone valuable." "Exactly," he said simply. "So why would I care what people think when they're measuring worth with the wrong ruler?" That conversation crystallized something I'd been feeling for months. Marcus Wellington was everything I hadn't known I was looking for. He was kind and principled and passionate about making a difference in the world. He treated me as an equal partner, genuinely interested in my thoughts and dreams. He made me laugh until my sides hurt and held me when work stress became overwhelming. And perhaps most importantly, he truly saw me in ways my own family never had. A year and a half into our relationship, during a weekend camping trip in Yosemite, Marcus proposed. We had hiked to a secluded spot near Vernal Fall, where the mist from the waterfall created rainbows in the afternoon sun. He pulled a small wooden box from his backpack, handcrafted by one of his students' fathers who was a woodworker. Inside was a silver ring with a deep blue sapphire, simple and elegant and perfect. "This isn't the biggest diamond or the fanciest setting," Marcus said, his voice slightly shaky with nervousness. "But sapphires represent wisdom and loyalty and truth. That's what I see when I look at you, Elena. And that's what I promise to bring to our marriage. Not wealth or status, but a partnership built on the things that actually matter." I said yes through happy tears, and we sat by that waterfall for hours, talking about our future. We envisioned a life of purpose rather than luxury, of meaningful work rather than prestigious careers, of building something real together rather than maintaining appearances. We talked about eventually buying a modest house in a diverse neighborhood with good public schools. We discussed the possibility of adopting older children from the foster system, kids who needed stable homes and patient parents. We dreamed about traveling during summer breaks, not to luxury resorts but to places where we could volunteer and immerse ourselves in different cultures. My ring fit perfectly, both literally and symbolically. I loved everything about it, from the way the sapphire caught the light to the personal meaning Marcus had invested in choosing it. When I returned to school on Monday, my fellow teachers admired it enthusiastically. My second-grade students gathered around my desk, their eyes wide with wonder at the pretty blue stone. One of them, a little girl named Mia whose family had immigrated from Guatemala, touched it gently and said, "It's like the ocean where my abuela lives." So beautiful. I knew my family would have a different reaction, but I underestimated just how cruel their judgment would be. I waited 2 weeks before mentioning my engagement to my mother, and even then only because Isabel had heard through a mutual acquaintance and was already spreading the news. My mother called me immediately, her voice tight with what I recognized as performative excitement. "An engagement, how wonderful. We simply must throw you an engagement party. The Riverside Club has availability next month. I'll call the event coordinator today." Before I could respond, she continued, "Now, I know your budget is limited, so your father and I will cover the costs. We can't have people thinking we don't celebrate our daughter's milestones appropriately." The implication was clear. Left to my own devices, any celebration I could afford would embarrass them. I felt the familiar mixture of hurt and frustration that accompanied most interactions with my mother, but I pushed it aside. "That's generous, Mom, but Marcus and I were thinking of something simple. Maybe a backyard barbecue with close friends and family." The silence on the other end of the line was arctic. "Elena, I've been planning weddings and engagement parties for 30 years. Trust me on this. We'll do it properly at the club. I'll text you the date once I confirm." She hung up before I could argue further. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late April. My mother had invited approximately 80 people, most of whom I barely knew. They were her friends, my father's business associates, extended family members I saw once a year if that. Marcus's guest list consisted of his parents, who would be flying in from Chicago, and a handful of his close friends from the faculty. In the week leading up to the party, my mother called me daily with updates that felt more like directives. The dress code was cocktail attire, which she emphasized repeatedly as if afraid I might show up in my usual Target clearance rack finds. She had selected a menu of past hors d'oeuvres and champagne, dismissing my suggestion of a more substantial meal as unnecessary for a party that would only last 3 hours. The photographer she'd hired specialized in society events, someone who would provide images suitable for the local magazine's social pages. "We need to present this appropriately," she explained when I questioned why we needed a professional photographer at all. "People will be curious about who Marcus is, given that no one in our circle knows his family. We want to make sure the optics are right." I wanted to scream that optics shouldn't matter, that what should matter was two people in love celebrating their commitment. But I'd learned long ago that arguing with my mother about her values was an exercise in futility. I agreed to her plans while privately vowing that our actual wedding would reflect our values, not hers. The night before the engagement party, Marcus's parents arrived in Sacramento. James and Caroline Wellington checked into a modest hotel near the airport, declining my mother's offer to stay at their house with its guest suite and pool. When Marcus picked them up for dinner at our favorite casual Italian place, I met them for the first time, and immediately understood where Marcus had gotten his values. James Wellington was not at all what I expected. I knew from Marcus that his father was successful in business, something to do with technology and investments, but Marcus rarely discussed his family's financial situation and I had never thought to press for details. The man who embraced me in a warm hug at the restaurant entrance was dressed in khakis and a simple button-down shirt, driving a rental car that was practical rather than flashy. His wife Caroline wore a cheerful sundress and comfortable sandals, her face lighting up with genuine warmth when she met me. Over dinner, they asked thoughtful questions about my teaching, my students, and my family. They shared stories about Marcus's childhood, painting a picture of a boy who had always been more interested in his guitar than in the trappings of wealth. When the check came, James insisted on paying, but chose the modestly priced house wine rather than ordering something expensive and showy. "We're so happy Marcus found you," Caroline said as we left the restaurant. "He talks about you constantly. Your kindness, your dedication to your students, your values. He said he's never met anyone who understands what truly matters the way you do." Her words touched me deeply, highlighting the stark contrast between her genuine warmth and my own mother's conditional approval. As I drove home that night, I found myself hoping that whatever Marcus's family thought of my relatives at tomorrow's party, they wouldn't judge me by association. The next evening, I arrived at the Riverside Club an hour before the party was scheduled to start, as my mother had insisted I needed to be there for setup inspection. The event space was decorated with elaborate floral arrangements, soft lighting, and elegant table settings that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. Everything looked beautiful in that carefully curated way that felt more like a museum exhibit than a celebration. My mother stood in the center of the room with her event coordinator, making final adjustments to the gift table placement. She looked me up and down when I entered, her eyes narrowing slightly at my dress. I'd chosen a simple navy blue cocktail dress from Nordstrom Rack, one of my more expensive purchases but still modest by her standards. "That's what you're wearing?" she asked, her tone making clear it was not really a question but a judgment. "Yes, this is what I'm wearing," I replied, willing my voice to stay calm. "It's appropriate for a cocktail party." She sighed dramatically. "Well, I suppose it will have to do. At least the sapphire in your ring matches. Speaking of which, let me see it again." She reached for my hand before I could respond, holding my ring up to the light with the same critical expression she might use to examine a questionable piece of fruit at the grocery store. "Still so understated. I keep hoping it will look more substantial in different lighting, but it really is quite simple, isn't it?" The comment stung, as I'm sure she intended it to. Before I could formulate a response, my sister Isabel swept into the room wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She kissed my cheek, her eyes immediately going to my ring hand. "Oh my God, Elena, I keep forgetting how tiny that stone is. You should see some of the rings the girls in my yoga class have. Absolutely stunning. 3 carats minimum." "I love my ring," I said firmly. "It's perfect for me." "If you say so," Isabel replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I mean, everyone has different priorities, right? Some people value size and quality, others prefer something more affordable. No judgment." Her entire statement was judgment wrapped in a thin veneer of acceptance. I felt my jaw clenching, a headache beginning to form behind my eyes. This was going to be a long evening. Guests began arriving at 6 o'clock sharp. My parents positioned themselves near the entrance to greet everyone, with Isabel hovering nearby to display her own engagement ring for comparison whenever someone admired mine. I stood slightly apart with Marcus, who squeezed my hand reassuringly whenever my family's comments became particularly cutting. Marcus's parents arrived at 6:15, looking decidedly out of place among the country club crowd in their understated clothing. My mother greeted them with performative warmth, immediately launching into questions about where they were staying and what they thought of Sacramento. Within minutes, I could see her mental categorization at work, assessing their worth based on surface-level markers. The rehearsal dinner wasn't actually a rehearsal dinner, I realized as guests continued to pour in. My mother had billed it as an engagement celebration, but it had all the hallmarks of her usual social climbing events. She was networking, introducing people to her business contacts, showing off the venue and the spread. Marcus and I were props in her larger social performance. About an hour into the party, my mother clinked her glass to get everyone's attention. "Thank you all so much for coming to celebrate Elena and Marcus," she began, her voice carrying across the room with practiced ease. "As most of you know, our Elena has always been our independent daughter, marching to the beat of her own drum. She chose teaching over more lucrative careers, and now she's chosen love over, well, other considerations." Uncomfortable laughter rippled through the crowd. I felt my face burning with humiliation. Marcus's hand tightened around mine, his jaw set in a way I recognized as controlled anger. My mother continued, apparently oblivious to or unconcerned with our discomfort. Marcus is a music teacher, which is just lovely. Every school needs music programs, don't they? And while teaching doesn't come with the financial rewards of some professions, it's certainly noble work. She raised her glass. To Elena and Marcus, may love be enough to sustain them. The toast fell flat, most guests raising their glasses awkwardly while exchanging meaningful glances. I wanted to disappear, to somehow transport myself out of this nightmare and into literally any other scenario. But there was nowhere to go, no escape from the spotlight my mother had deliberately positioned over us. As people returned to their conversations and appetizers, the comments began. They started quietly, whispered observations that weren't quite whispered enough. Did you see her ring? I heard someone murmur near the bar. You'd think he could have saved up for something nicer if he knew he was marrying into this family. An older woman I vaguely recognized as one of my mother's bridge club friends approached me with a condescending smile. Your ring is very unique, dear. Is that a real sapphire or one of those lab-created stones? I can never tell the difference anymore. Before I could answer, she continued, either way, it's the thought that counts, right? Not everyone can afford natural gemstones, especially on a teacher's salary. My Aunt Gloria, never one for subtlety, examined my ring with theatrical curiosity. Patricia told me it was small, but I didn't realize she meant this small. What is that, maybe half a carat? Quarter carat? She shook her head sympathetically. Well, at least you're both in the same financial bracket. That's important for compatibility, they say. Each comment built on the last, a crescendo of judgment disguised as concern or curiosity. My cousin Brandon made a joke about cubic zirconia. Isabel's fiancé, a hedge fund manager named Trevor, loudly discussed the importance of diamond clarity and color grading within earshot of our table. Even the catering staff seemed to be whispering, though perhaps that was my paranoid imagination working overtime. I watched Marcus's face as each comment landed, seeing his expression grow darker and more closed off. I knew him well enough to recognize when he was approaching his limit. His usually easy smile had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that suggested he was counting down until we could politely leave. Then came the moment that pushed everything over the edge. We were seated at a large round table with my parents, Isabel and Trevor, Marcus's parents, and two of my father's business colleagues. Dinner had just been served, and conversation limped along with awkward pauses and forced pleasantries. My mother, apparently unsatisfied with the level of humiliation she'd already inflicted, decided to direct the spotlight even more intensely on my ring. She reached across the table, beckoning me to hand over my left hand. Let me see it in this lighting, she said with what she probably thought was an encouraging smile. The chandelier might make it look more substantial. Reluctantly, I extended my hand across the table. My mother held it up, turning it back and forth so the sapphire caught the crystal light above us. The entire table fell silent, watching this spectacle with varying degrees of discomfort. Is this from a gumball machine, sweetie? My mother asked, her voice carrying to neighboring tables. I mean, I know teachers don't make much, but surely Marcus could have afforded something with an actual diamond. The words hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and suffocating. I heard Vanessa's giggle from the next table over. I saw Isabel smirking into her champagne glass. I felt Trevor's pitying look and my father's embarrassed expression. Most painfully, I saw the hurt flash across Marcus's face before he masked it with careful neutrality. My hand instinctively curled into a fist, trying to hide the ring I loved, trying to protect both it and myself from this unprovoked cruelty. I opened my mouth to respond, though what I would have said I'll never know, because at that exact moment, a voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. That ring represents something your daughter values far more than carats or price tags. Everyone at the table turned toward the source of the voice. James Wellington had set down his wine glass and was looking directly at my mother with an expression of calm authority that commanded immediate attention. The conversations at neighboring tables faltered and died as people tuned into the drama unfolding at the head table. She's my partner in raising a son who understands that a person's worth isn't measured in dollars, James continued, his voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone. Elena chose that sapphire because it represents loyalty and wisdom. Marcus chose it because he knows his future wife values meaning over materialism. I find that refreshingly mature in an age where people mistake price tags for character. My mother's hand, still holding my left hand, began to tremble slightly. She released me and lowered the ring back to the table, her face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. The entire room had gone absolutely silent, every guest transfixed by this unexpected confrontation. James wasn't finished. He stood slowly, his full height and presence making him suddenly appear much more formidable than his earlier casual demeanor had suggested. Marcus tells me Elena teaches special needs children in an underfunded school district. That she spends her own money on classroom supplies. That she stays late every day to tutor students whose parents work multiple jobs and can't help with homework. That she has transformed struggling readers into confident learners and given children with disabilities the support they need to thrive. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests before returning to my mother. I've built a career advising wealthy people on their investments. I can tell you with absolute certainty that the return on investment Elena generates through her work is infinitely more valuable than any diamond you could purchase at Tiffany's. The lives she changes, the futures she helps build, the hope she provides to families who have very little, that's real wealth. That's the kind of wealth that actually matters. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Isabel's smirk had vanished entirely. My mother looked as if she'd been slapped, her carefully constructed social performance crumbling under the weight of James Wellington's quiet condemnation. So when I see that ring, James said, his tone softening slightly as he looked at me with genuine warmth, I don't see something cheap or inadequate. I see a symbol of two people who have their priorities straight. Who understand that a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect will outlast any marriage based on financial considerations or social status. He raised his glass, still standing, commanding every eye in the room. To Elena and Marcus, two remarkable teachers who are making the world better one student at a time. May their marriage be as rich in love and purpose as they are in character. The silence that followed was absolute. No one seemed to know how to respond to this unprecedented rebuke delivered with such controlled precision. Finally, Caroline Wellington stood as well, raising her glass to join her husband's toast. To Elena and Marcus, she said warmly. Slowly, awkwardly, others began to stand and raise their glasses. The murmured repetition of, to Elena and Marcus, rippled across the room, though many guests looked distinctly uncomfortable, unsure whether they had just witnessed a beautiful tribute or a devastating takedown of my parents' values. I sat frozen in my seat, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions. Gratitude toward James for his defense of both Marcus and me. Vindication that someone had finally articulated what I'd felt for years about my family's warped priorities. Relief that Marcus's father understood and valued who I was rather than judging me by my modest circumstances. And beneath it all, a profound sadness that it had taken a stranger's intervention to protect me from my own mother's cruelty. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride in his father and empathy for my visible distress. Across from us, my mother had gone very pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father was studying his plate as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Isabel whispered something to Trevor, who nodded sympathetically while shooting worried glances at my parents. The remainder of the dinner passed in uncomfortable near silence at our table, though gradually conversations resumed at others as guests processed what had just occurred. Some shot sympathetic looks in my direction. Others avoided eye contact entirely, clearly uncomfortable with the exposed family dysfunction. A few older guests, I noticed, nodded approvingly toward James Wellington, perhaps recognizing in his words a critique of materialism they themselves had considered but never voiced. When dessert was served, my mother made no additional toasts or speeches. She picked at her tiramisu without eating much, responding in monosyllables when people approached to thank her for the lovely party. The word lovely was clearly being used generously, given the tension that still hung in the air like humidity before a storm. As soon as was politely possible, Marcus and I made our excuses and prepared to leave. His parents had already departed, citing an early flight the next morning, though I suspected they were giving us space to process everything without their presence adding additional complexity. As we headed toward the exit, my mother intercepted us in the foyer. "Elena, I think we need to talk about what just happened," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "That man, Marcus's father, he embarrassed our entire family in front of everyone we know." I felt something shift inside me, a tectonic plate of suppressed frustration finally reaching its breaking point. "He told the truth, Mom. That's what embarrassed you." Not his words, but the reality they exposed about how you've treated Marcus and me all evening. "I was simply making conversation," she protested. "If you're going to be oversensitive about every little comment, asking if my engagement ring came from a gumball machine isn't making conversation," I interrupted, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "It's deliberate cruelty disguised as humor. You've been undermining my choices, my career, my relationship, and my fiancé all night. You turned our engagement party into a platform to showcase your values at the expense of mine." My father had appeared beside my mother, his expression suggesting he wanted to de-escalate the situation quickly. "Elena, let's not make a scene. People are still here." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before Mom decided to publicly humiliate me and Marcus," I replied. The scene was already made. James Wellington just refused to let it go unchallenged. Isabel emerged from the event space, clearly having been sent to check on the situation. "What's going on? People are asking questions." "Tell them the truth," I said, surprising myself with my boldness. "Tell them that for once, someone called out the cruelty and materialism that this family has elevated to an art form. Tell them that not everyone measures success in dollar signs and status symbols." My mother's face had gone from pale to flushed, anger finally breaking through her careful composure. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you speak to us? We gave you this party. We've supported you despite your disappointing choices. And you repay us with disrespect?" The word disappointing landed like a physical blow, but this time, instead of absorbing it and internalizing the shame, I felt something else. Clarity. The realization that their disappointment in me was actually my liberation from their limited definition of success. "I'm grateful for the party you threw," I said carefully, choosing my words with precision. "But it was never really for me, was it? It was for you, to maintain appearances, to control the narrative about who I am and what my marriage represents. You wanted a celebration that fit your social standards, not one that reflected Marcus and me." "That's not fair," my father interjected weakly. "What's not fair," I replied, my voice catching slightly with emotion, "is spending my entire adult life trying to earn approval that was always conditional on becoming someone I'm not. What's not fair is being made to feel ashamed of meaningful work because it doesn't generate wealth. What's not fair is the man I love being treated with condescension and disdain because he chose a career of service over profit." Marcus had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now he stepped closer to me, his presence a physical reminder that I wasn't alone in this confrontation. "Elena, we should go," he said quietly. "This conversation isn't productive right now." He was right, of course. No breakthrough understanding would emerge from this heated moment. My family's values weren't going to shift because of one difficult conversation, and my newfound clarity wouldn't be enhanced by continuing to engage with their defensive justifications. "You're right," I said to Marcus, then turned back to my parents. "Thank you for the party. I'm sorry it didn't end the way you envisioned. I need some time to think about our relationship and what healthy boundaries might look like going forward." "Boundaries?" my mother repeated, the words seemingly foreign to her vocabulary. "Elena, you're being dramatic. This is just family dynamics. Everyone's family has disagreements. This isn't a disagreement, Mom. This is a fundamental difference in values that's been building for years. I can't keep pretending it doesn't matter." Without waiting for a response, I took Marcus's hand and walked out of the Riverside Club into the warm April evening. Behind me, I heard my mother calling my name, my father saying something about talking when everyone had calmed down, Isabel declaring the whole situation ridiculous. But I kept walking toward the parking lot, toward Marcus's dependable Honda, toward a future that suddenly felt less constrained by the expectations I'd been carrying my entire life. We sat in the car for several minutes before either of us spoke. Marcus started the engine but didn't pull out of the parking spot, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I'm so sorry," we both said simultaneously, then laughed weakly at the absurdity of both apologizing. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Marcus said firmly. "Your mother's behavior was inexcusable. The way they all spoke about you, about us, about your ring." He shook his head. "I knew they were judgmental, but I didn't fully understand how deep it went until tonight." "Your dad," I began, my voice thick with unshed tears. "What he said, standing up like that. Marcus, I've never had anyone defend me that way. My own parents have never protected me from cruelty the way your father just did." Marcus reached over and took my hand, bringing it to his lips to kiss my knuckles gently. "My dad's always been able to cut through bullshit and get to what matters. He built his company on the principle that real value isn't always visible on balance sheets. When he heard your mother mocking your ring, mocking you essentially, he wasn't going to let that stand." "Did you know he was going to say something?" I asked. "No idea. But I should have expected it. He has a pretty low tolerance for people who mistake price tags for worth." Marcus smiled slightly. "He called me last week after meeting you, told me I'd better not screw this up because you were the real deal. He recognized in 30 minutes what your family apparently can't see after knowing you for 30 years. The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. Marcus pulled me into an awkward hug across the center console, letting me cry into his shoulder while he murmured reassurances. When I finally pulled back, wiping my eyes with the cocktail napkin I'd stuffed in my purse, I felt emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter. "What do we do now?" I asked. "I just basically told my parents I need distance from them. Isabel's probably already texting everyone we know about how I caused a scene. This is going to get messy." "Then it gets messy," Marcus said with a shrug. "Elena, I love you. Not despite your family's situation, but including all the complicated parts of your life. If standing up for yourself means dealing with fallout, then we deal with it together. That's what partners do." Partners. The word James Wellington had used in his toast. Not just romantic partners, but life partners who faced challenges together, who supported each other's growth, who built something meaningful beyond material wealth. Looking at Marcus in the dim parking lot light, I felt a surge of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. This man, this wonderful, principled, kind man had chosen me. And his family, unlike mine, saw my value clearly. "I love you too," I said. "And I love my ring. I love everything it represents." "Good," Marcus replied, his trademark smile finally returning. "Because I'm pretty sure gumball machine rings don't come with lifetime warranties." His joke broke the remaining tension, and I laughed genuinely for the first time all evening. We drove back to my apartment in companionable silence, both of us processing the evening's events and what they meant for our future. As we pulled into my parking lot, my phone buzzed with incoming messages. I didn't need to look to know they were from my family, probably a mix of recriminations and demands for apologies. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the compulsion to immediately respond, to smooth things over, to make myself smaller to accommodate their comfort. Instead, I silenced my phone and took Marcus's hand as we walked to my door. Whatever came next, whatever consequences emerged from tonight's confrontation, I would face them with my partner beside me. The person who truly saw my worth. The person whose family recognized value that couldn't be measured in carats or dollars. The person who had given me a ring that symbolized exactly what mattered most. Loyalty. Wisdom. Truth. And a love that didn't require me to be anyone other than exactly who I was. The morning after the engagement party, I woke to 73 text messages, 14 missed calls, and a voicemail inbox that had reached its capacity limit. My phone had been charging on my nightstand, and even in sleep mode, the constant buzzing of incoming notifications had infiltrated my dreams, turning them anxious and fragmented. Marcus had stayed over, and I found him already awake in my tiny kitchen, making coffee with the methodical care he brought to everything he did. "I unplugged your phone around 3 in the morning," he admitted, handing me a steaming mug. It wouldn't stop buzzing. I figured whatever they had to say could wait until you'd gotten some actual sleep. I took the coffee gratefully, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic. Through my apartment window, the early morning light cast long shadows across the hardwood floor. It was Sunday, typically a day I spent meal prepping for the week and grading papers. The normalcy of that routine felt impossibly distant from where I stood now, on the other side of a confrontation that had fundamentally altered my family relationships. I suppose I should look at the messages, I said without enthusiasm. Marcus settled onto my second-hand couch, patting the cushion beside him. Only if you're ready. They'll still be there in an hour, or tomorrow, or next week. You get to decide when you're prepared to engage. His permission to wait, to prioritize my own readiness over their urgency, felt revolutionary. I'd spent 3 decades responding immediately to my family's demands, treating their needs as automatically more important than my own emotional capacity. But Marcus was right. The messages weren't going anywhere, and my mental state mattered more than their impatience. I sat beside him, and we drank our coffee in silence while morning birdsong filtered through the slightly open window. After my second cup, I finally picked up my phone and began scrolling through the notifications. The messages fell into predictable categories. My mother's texts oscillated between wounded martyr and righteous anger. After all we've done for you, featured prominently, as did variations on ungrateful and disrespectful. She had apparently sent these messages throughout the night, each one more accusatory than the last, building a case for my moral failure. My father's messages were fewer but more strategic. He employed his business negotiation tactics, framing the situation as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through rational discussion. Let's put emotions aside and talk this through like adults, one text read, as if my emotional response to cruelty was the problem rather than the cruelty itself. Isabel's messages were the most varied. Some expressed genuine confusion about why I was making such a big deal out of what she characterized as harmless teasing. Others were more cutting, suggesting I was being oversensitive and dramatic. A few, sent late into the night, hinted at concern about how my behavior was affecting our parents, positioning me as the source of family discord rather than someone responding to long-standing mistreatment. Then there were the messages from extended family members, clearly dispatched by my mother to apply additional pressure. Aunt Gloria wanted to know if I was having some kind of breakdown. Cousin Brandon suggested I owed my parents an apology for embarrassing them in front of their friends. My Uncle Richard, always the designated peacemaker, proposed a family meeting to clear the air and move forward. Notably absent were any messages acknowledging that my mother's behavior had been inappropriate, that publicly mocking my engagement ring had been cruel, or that I might have legitimate grievances worth addressing. The entire family narrative had already been established. I was the problem. My reaction was disproportionate. My boundaries were unreasonable. Anything surprising in there? Marcus asked, watching my face as I scrolled. Not really. It's exactly what I expected. I'm being cast as the villain in their version of events. I set the phone down with a sigh. The thing that gets me is how coordinated it all feels. Like they have a playbook for managing family members who step out of line. That's because they do, Marcus observed. Maybe not a written playbook, but definitely an established pattern. From what you've told me about your family dynamics over the years, this is their standard operating procedure. Someone challenges the status quo, they circle the wagons, apply pressure from multiple angles until the person capitulates and falls back in line. His analysis was uncomfortably accurate. I'd watched this same dynamic play out when my cousin Melissa had chosen to move across the country for her career instead of staying local as the family expected. The whisper campaign, the guilt trips, the strategic deployment of family members to convince her she was being selfish had continued for months until she'd finally limited contact with everyone. At the time, I'd participated in some of those conversations, believing the family narrative that Melissa was abandoning everyone. Now I recognized it for what it had been, punishment for autonomy. I don't want to be estranged from my family, I said quietly. Despite everything, I still love them. But I also can't keep sacrificing my dignity and self-respect to maintain their version of family harmony. Marcus pulled me closer, kissing the top of my head. Those don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can love them and have boundaries. You can care about them while refusing to accept mistreatment. The question is whether they can accept a relationship on those terms. That was indeed the question, and I suspected the answer would reveal itself in the coming days and weeks. For now, I needed to respond to the barrage of messages, but I needed to do so from a place of clarity rather than reactive emotion. I spent the rest of Sunday crafting a single message that I would send to my parents, with a slightly modified version for extended family members. The message took me 4 hours and 7 drafts to compose. I wanted to be clear without being inflammatory, firm without being cruel, honest without being vindictive. Finally, with Marcus reading over my shoulder and offering occasional suggestions, I settled on this: Mom and Dad, I need you to understand that my reaction last night wasn't about being oversensitive or dramatic. It was about reaching a breaking point after years of having my choices, my career, my relationship, and my values dismissed and belittled. What happened at the engagement party was deeply hurtful, and James Wellington's response, while perhaps uncomfortable for you, was a defense of basic human dignity that shouldn't have been necessary. I love you both, but I need some time and space to process everything. I'm not interested in a family meeting or mediated discussions right now. When I'm ready to talk, I'll reach out. In the meantime, I need you to respect my need for distance. Elena. I read it over 3 times, my finger hovering over the send button while my heart hammered in my chest. This message represented something I'd never done before. Asserting my needs without apology, establishing a boundary without immediately offering compromise, prioritizing my well-being over their comfort. It felt simultaneously empowering and terrifying. It's perfect, Marcus said. It's clear, it's not mean, and it establishes what you need. Send it. I pressed send before I could second-guess myself further, then immediately put my phone on Do Not Disturb mode. Whatever their response, I didn't want to see it immediately. I needed to sit with my decision, to let it settle, to resist the immediate compulsion to check if they'd replied and what they'd said. Monday morning arrived with the harsh reality of having to return to normal life while processing extraordinary emotional upheaval. My second graders didn't care about my family drama. They needed me present, focused, and ready to guide them through their multiplication tables and reading comprehension exercises. I was grateful for the distraction, for the way teaching demanded my full attention and left little room for spiraling thoughts about family conflict. During lunch, I finally checked my phone. My parents had responded, but not in the way I'd hoped. My mother's text was brief and cold. If you need space, you'll have it. Don't expect us to reach out until you're ready to have a mature conversation about your behavior. My father's message was similarly distant. We'll respect your wishes, though we're disappointed you're choosing to handle this situation this way. The messages stung, particularly their framing of my boundary setting as childish behavior that disappointed them. But I also recognized the manipulation inherent in their responses. By casting themselves as the patient, reasonable parents waiting for their wayward daughter to come to her senses, they maintained their narrative of being the wronged party. It was frustrating, but not unexpected. What I didn't anticipate was the social fallout that began manifesting over the following week. My mother's book club friends, women I'd known since childhood, stopped acknowledging me at the grocery store. My father's golf buddy's wife, who had always been friendly when our paths crossed, now avoided eye contact entirely. Isabel posted cryptic social media messages about family loyalty and ungrateful siblings, messages clearly meant for me though never naming me directly. The Whisper campaign had begun in earnest. I knew because mutual acquaintances started asking careful questions. I heard there was some tension at your engagement party. Is everything okay? Or, your mom mentioned you're going through a difficult time. Each inquiry required a delicate response. I didn't want to badmouth my family, but I also refused to accept full responsibility for a situation they had largely created. Marcus's parents, in stark contrast, called midweek to check in. Caroline spoke with such genuine warmth and concern that I found myself tearing up in my classroom during my planning period. We just wanted you to know that we think you handled a really difficult situation with remarkable grace, she said. What happened at that party was unconscionable, and we're proud of you for standing up for yourself. I'm worried I overreacted, I admitted, the doubt that had been gnawing at me finally finding voice. Maybe I should have just let it go, laughed it off, not made such a big deal out of some comments about my ring. Elena, honey, it wasn't about the ring, Caroline said gently. It was about respect, and your mother showed you none. You didn't overreact. You finally reacted proportionally to a pattern of disrespect that's apparently been going on for years. That's not the same thing. Her validation meant more to me than I could express. Having parental figures who saw the situation clearly and supported my response helped counterbalance the narrative my own parents were constructing. James got on the line briefly to reiterate that he had no regrets about what he'd said, that truth-telling sometimes created discomfort but was necessary nonetheless. After we hung up, I sat in my classroom surrounded by construction paper alphabet letters and student artwork, feeling a complicated mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the family relationships that might never recover, relief that I'd finally stopped contorting myself to fit into their narrow definition of acceptable behavior and values. 2 weeks passed with radio silence from my parents. Isabel sent occasional texts, most of them variations on, "Are you ready to apologize yet?" as if the entire situation could be resolved through my unilateral contrition. I didn't respond to those messages, recognizing them as attempts to pull me back into patterns that no longer served me. My students noticed that something was different, though they couldn't articulate what. Children are remarkably perceptive about adult emotional states. One of my students, a 8-year-old named Jordan who struggled with anxiety, asked me during recess if I was sad about something. I told him I was working through some grown-up problems but that I was okay, and his small hand patting my arm in comfort nearly undid me completely. Marcus became my anchor during this period. He never pressured me to reconcile with my family or to maintain distance. He simply remained present, listening when I needed to process, distracting me when I needed to think about anything else, and consistently reminding me that I deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. His steadiness helped me resist the gravitational pull of old patterns, the familiar compulsion to fix things by making myself smaller. 3 weeks after the engagement party, I received an unexpected text from Uncle Peter, who had been present at my parents' house during what I now thought of as the ambush meeting. His message was brief. "Elena, I've been thinking about what your mother said at the engagement party and your response. I owe you an apology for not speaking up sooner about how your parents treat you differently than your sister. It's been obvious for years, and I should have said something. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." His message surprised me enough that I actually called him back, something I'd never done unprompted in my adult life. Uncle Peter answered on the second ring, and we had the most honest conversation I'd ever had with an extended family member. He acknowledged what he'd observed over the years, the way my accomplishments were minimized while Isabel's were celebrated, the way my choices were questioned while hers were supported, the way expectations for me were rigid while exceptions were made for her. "I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in how your parents raised you," he admitted. "But I've come to realize that silence in the face of unfair treatment is its own form of participation." When James Wellington stood up at that party and said what needed to be said, I felt ashamed that I'd never had the courage to do the same. His apology and acknowledgement didn't change the situation with my parents, but it did provide validation that I wasn't imagining the differential treatment, wasn't being oversensitive about patterns that others had also observed. We talked for over an hour, and by the end of the conversation, I felt like I'd gained an ally in a family system that had previously felt uniformly aligned against any challenge to its established dynamics. As March turned into April, I found myself settling into a strange new normal. Life continued. I taught my students, graded papers, attended faculty meetings, and planned lessons. Marcus and I moved forward with wedding planning, choosing a small ceremony at a local botanical garden with a reception at a restaurant we loved. We deliberately kept the guest list small, inviting only people who genuinely supported our relationship and shared our values. My parents and Isabel were technically invited, but I didn't expect them to attend given our continued estrangement. My mother broke the silence 6 weeks after the engagement party with a phone call rather than a text. I was in the middle of preparing dinner when my phone rang, her name appearing on the screen and making my stomach drop. I let it ring 3 times before answering, needing those extra seconds to steel myself for whatever was coming. "Elena," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone I recognized as forced pleasantness masking deeper emotions. I think it's time we talked. Okay, I replied carefully, setting down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables and moving to the living room where I could sit down. I'm listening. Your father and I have been giving you the space you requested, she began, already framing the conversation as their generous accommodation of my unreasonable demand. We thought you'd come around by now and realize that you overreacted at the engagement party. But since you haven't, we need to address this situation before it goes on much longer. Mom, I didn't overreact, I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible. I responded appropriately to being publicly humiliated. There's a difference. Humiliated? Elena, you're being dramatic. I made one little comment about your ring. If you're so insecure about it that you can't handle a bit of teasing, that's something you need to work on, not blame on me. The gaslighting was so blatant I almost laughed. You asked if my engagement ring came from a gumball machine in front of 80 people. That wasn't teasing. That was cruelty dressed up as humor. You've always been too sensitive, she countered, deploying one of her favorite criticisms. Not everything is a personal attack. Sometimes you need to develop a thicker skin and learn to laugh at yourself. I have a thick skin, Mom. I developed it out of necessity from years of having my choices and values belittled by this family. What I don't have anymore is a willingness to pretend that belittling is normal or acceptable. Is that what your therapist told you? She asked, her tone dripping with condescension. I hadn't mentioned seeing Dr. Lewis to my family, but apparently the grapevine had been active. That everyone in your family is terrible and you're the victim? Because that's a very convenient narrative that avoids any accountability for your own behavior. My therapist has helped me recognize patterns I couldn't see clearly before, I replied. But the observations about differential treatment aren't coming from her. They're coming from a lifetime of experiencing it and finally acknowledging what it's done to me. My mother sighed dramatically. Here we go with the Isabel complaints again. You've been jealous of your sister since she was born. This is just another manifestation of that sibling rivalry. It's not rivalry when one child consistently receives more support, more grace, and more understanding than the other, I said, feeling my carefully maintained calm beginning to crack. It's favoritism. And pretending it doesn't exist doesn't make it any less real or damaging. We've treated you both fairly, my mother insisted. If anything, we've been harder on Isabel because she's more sensitive and needs more guidance. You've always been independent and capable. You didn't need as much from us. There it was, the justification I'd heard countless times in various forms. My competence and independence, rather than being celebrated, had been used as rationale for providing me with less support. The circular logic that because I succeeded despite lack of support, I must not have needed support. The assumption that being capable meant I didn't deserve encouragement or resources. Mom, do you hear what you're saying? You're telling me that because I learned to function without support, that justified continuing to withhold support. That's not fair treatment. That's penalizing independence while rewarding dependence. I'm not going to argue about ancient history, she said, her voice hardening. What I called about is this: your father and I have decided that we will attend your wedding, but only if you apologize for your behavior at the engagement party and agree to have a proper conversation with us about your attitude. Her ultimatum hung in the air between us. She was offering conditional attendance at my wedding, as if their presence was a gift I needed to earn through submission and apology. The old Elena would have immediately begun calculating what words might satisfy them, how she could craft an apology that would restore peace without requiring them to acknowledge any wrongdoing. The new Elena, the one who had walked out of a family meeting and stood her ground for 6 weeks, had a different response. Mom, I'm not going to apologize for setting boundaries or for defending myself and Marcus from cruel comments. If your attendance at my wedding requires me to pretend that none of that happened or to accept full responsibility for a conflict you created, then I guess you won't be attending. The silence that followed was so complete I thought the call might have dropped. When my mother spoke again, her voice was ice. You would really exclude your own parents from your wedding over this? You're excluding yourselves, I corrected gently. You're making your attendance conditional on my compliance with demands I can't in good conscience meet. I would love to have you there, but not at the cost of my self-respect. This is unbelievable, she said, her voice rising. After everything we've done for you, you're willing to cut us out of your life over some perceived slight? It wasn't perceived, Mom. It happened. In front of dozens of witnesses. And I'm not cutting you out of my life. I'm establishing what a healthy relationship between us might look like, which includes mutual respect and accountability. If that's not something you can accept, then yeah, our relationship is going to look different than it has. Your father is going to be devastated, she said, switching tactics to emotional manipulation. He's been telling everyone about walking his daughter down the aisle. Now what is he supposed to say? He can say that his daughter is getting married in a ceremony that reflects her values, and he's welcome to attend if he can respect those values. Or he can say whatever he wants. I can't control his narrative or yours. I can only control my own boundaries and choices. My mother made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. You've changed, Elena. This isn't like you. You're right, I agreed. The old me would have apologized by now to restore peace. Would have minimized my own hurt to protect your comfort. Would have made myself smaller to fit into the box you've constructed for me. But that version of me wasn't healthy or happy. So yeah, I've changed. I finally value myself enough to expect others to treat me with basic decency. Well, my mother said, her voice brittle, I hope you're happy with your choices. Don't expect your father and me to support a relationship built on disrespect and ingratitude. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone with a mixture of sadness and relief. The conversation had gone exactly as I'd anticipated, which somehow made it both less devastating and more final. My parents weren't capable of or willing to acknowledge their part in our conflict. They viewed my boundaries as attacks, my self-advocacy as betrayal, my growth as deterioration. Marcus came home about 20 minutes later to find me sitting in the semi-dark living room, dinner preparation abandoned on the kitchen counter. He took one look at my face and knew immediately that something significant had happened. I recounted the conversation while he listened without interruption, his hand finding mine and holding it tightly. I'm sorry, he said when I finished. I know you hoped they'd eventually come around. Part of me did, I admitted. But mostly I think I needed to have that conversation to confirm what I already knew. They're not going to change. They're not going to acknowledge wrongdoing or make space for the relationship I need. And I have to be okay with that. Are you okay with it? He asked. I thought about his question seriously before answering. I'm grieving, I said slowly, trying to articulate something I was only beginning to understand. I'm grieving the parents I needed and never had. The family I wanted but don't have. The unconditional acceptance I craved that was always just out of reach. But alongside that grief, there's also this weird sense of freedom. Like a weight I didn't fully recognize I was carrying has been lifted. Marcus pulled me close, and we sat together in the darkening room while I processed the reality that my parents likely wouldn't attend my wedding. It should have felt catastrophic, the kind of loss that would overshadow everything else. Instead, it felt clarifying. Their absence would be sad, but their presence under conditions that required my self-diminishment would be sadder. Over the next few weeks, I had similar conversations with various family members as word spread about the ultimatum my mother had delivered and my refusal to comply. Aunt Gloria called to tell me I was being stubborn and throwing away family over nothing. Cousin Brandon suggested I was letting my pride prevent reconciliation. Even some of my mother's friends reached out, apparently deputized to convince me to apologize and make peace. Each conversation followed a similar script. They would present my mother's version of events, in which she had made an innocent comment and I had wildly overreacted. They would remind me of all my parents had done for me, as if past decent parenting erased present harmful behavior. They would appeal to the importance of family, as if family bonds justified accepting mistreatment. And when I held firm in my boundaries, they would express disappointment, confusion, or judgment. Only a handful of people understood. Uncle Peter called regularly to check in, never pressuring me to reconcile but offering support for whatever I decided. A few of my mother's friends, women who had known me since childhood, privately reached out to say they'd witnessed the engagement party incident and thought my mother had been out of line, even if they couldn't say so publicly without risking their own relationships with her. And Marcus's parents continued to be a source of unwavering support, treating me with the parental care and respect my own parents seemed incapable of providing. My wedding day arrived in late May, on a perfect spring morning with clear blue skies and mild temperatures. The botanical garden was in full bloom, offering a natural beauty that required minimal additional decoration. Our guest list had shrunk to 40 people, all of whom genuinely supported our relationship and understood what our marriage represented. My parents' absence was noticeable, particularly during the processional when I walked down the aisle alone rather than being escorted by my father. Isabel hadn't come either, her loyalty to our parents apparently trumping any sisterly affection. But their empty seats were surrounded by people who loved me authentically, friends from college, colleagues from school, Marcus's extended family, and a handful of relatives who had chosen to attend despite my parents' implied pressure not to. Uncle Peter gave a short reading during the ceremony about the nature of true family, about how sometimes the people we choose become more family than those we're born to. Caroline Wellington dabbed at her eyes throughout the vows, and James stood to take photos even though we'd hired a professional photographer, wanting his own record of a day he later told me represented everything good about authentic partnership. The ceremony itself was simple and meaningful. Marcus and I had written our own vows, promising partnership, mutual respect, shared purpose, and unwavering support through whatever challenges life brought. When the officiant pronounced us married and we kissed while our guests applauded, I felt a completeness that had nothing to do with who wasn't there and everything to do with who was. The reception was held at a farm-to-table restaurant we discovered early in our relationship. Long tables were set up on an outdoor patio strung with cafe lights, and the meal was family-style with large platters passed around, encouraging conversation and connection. There were no assigned seats, no head table establishing hierarchy, no formal toasts that felt obligatory. Instead, people spoke when moved to, sharing memories and wishes in an organic flow that felt joyful rather than structured. James Wellington did eventually stand, his glass raised, and the conversations naturally quieted to hear what he would say. When Marcus first told us about Elena, he said he'd met someone who understood what really mattered in life. Someone who measured success not in dollars but in lives positively impacted. Someone who chose meaningful work over lucrative work because her purpose mattered more than her paycheck. He paused, looking directly at me with warmth that brought tears to my eyes. What he didn't tell us was how much courage that requires. How much strength it takes to maintain your values when everyone around you is pushing you toward different priorities. How much backbone is necessary to stand up for yourself when people who should protect you instead tear you down. His voice caught slightly, and Caroline reached up to squeeze his hand. But we saw that courage at an engagement party that didn't go quite as planned. And we see it today in Elena's face as she marries our son surrounded by people who actually see her worth. He raised his glass higher. To Elena and Marcus, may your marriage be built on the unshakable foundation of shared values, mutual respect, and the understanding that real wealth isn't measured in material possessions but in purpose, love, and authentic connection. The toast received enthusiastic applause and more than a few misty eyes. As people clinked glasses and conversations resumed, I caught James's eye across the patio and mouthed a silent thank you. He nodded, understanding passing between us that required no additional words. Later in the evening, as Marcus and I danced to a song his students had recorded as a wedding gift, I looked around at the faces of our guests. Every person there had chosen to celebrate with us, not out of obligation or social expectation, but out of genuine affection and support. The absence of my parents and sister still created a hollow ache in my chest, a grief that would probably never fully disappear. But that ache existed alongside a profound gratitude for the family I'd built through choice, for the partner who valued the same things I did, for the future we were creating together based on authenticity rather than appearances. My phone, which I'd silenced for the day, had been tucked into my small bridal purse. During a lull in the dancing, I made the mistake of checking it. There were 3 messages. One from Isabel, sent earlier that morning. Hope you enjoy your wedding without your family there. Don't expect us to forget this betrayal. One from my mother, time-stamped during what would have been our ceremony. Your father and I are thinking about what you're missing by excluding us. We hope it's worth it. And one from a number I didn't recognize. Congratulations on your wedding. I'm sorry your parents chose not to be there. You deserve better. From a friend of the family who's been watching this situation. The messages contained exactly what I'd expected from Isabel and my mother, one last attempt to make me feel guilty for boundaries they'd forced me to establish. But the anonymous message from the family friend caught me off guard, a reminder that even in families where dysfunction is normalized, there are often witnesses who recognize it for what it is, even if they can't or won't speak up publicly. I showed the messages to Marcus during our last dance of the evening. He read them, his jaw tightening, then pulled me closer. "Do you want to respond?" "No," I said, surprising myself with how certain I felt. "Not today. Today isn't about them or their guilt trips or their inability to see beyond their own narrative. Today is about us, about the life we're building, about the values we share. They chose not to be part of this, and that's their loss, not ours." As the reception wound down and guests began departing with hugs and best wishes, I felt a settledness I'd never experienced before. This was my life now, built on foundations I'd chosen rather than inherited. A marriage to a partner who respected me completely. A career that fulfilled my purpose even if it didn't impress my parents. A community of people who valued authenticity over appearances. And most importantly, a relationship with myself that prioritized dignity and self-respect over the exhausting project of earning conditional approval. The story of my cheap ring and the billionaire father who stood up for me had become something larger than that single moment at an engagement party. It had become a catalyst for examining family patterns, establishing healthy boundaries, and ultimately choosing a different path forward. Not everyone understood that choice, and some actively opposed it. But as Marcus and I drove away from our wedding reception toward a simple honeymoon at a cabin in the Sierras, I knew with certainty that I'd made the right decisions, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. The grief would persist. The complicated feelings about my family wouldn't simply dissolve. But underneath it all was a foundation of self-worth that no longer depended on their approval or acknowledgement. I'd found my voice, established my boundaries, and built a life that reflected my values. And that, I was learning, was worth more than any diamond they could have purchased or any approval they might have bestowed. The honeymoon cabin nestled among towering pines offered exactly the escape we needed. No cell service, no internet, just 5 days of hiking, reading by the fireplace, and talking about everything and nothing. Marcus taught me to identify bird calls while I showed him the constellations I'd learned as a kid during rare family camping trips. We cooked simple meals together and fell asleep to the sound of a nearby creek, our future stretching before us like an unmarked trail waiting to be explored. When we returned to Sacramento, reality reasserted itself with the usual demands of work and daily life. But something fundamental had shifted. I no longer checked my phone anxiously hoping for messages from my parents. I stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations where I finally said the perfect thing that would make them understand. I released the fantasy that they would suddenly recognize their behavior and apologize. Instead, I focused on building the life Marcus and I had envisioned, one intentional choice at a time. 3 months after our wedding, I received an unexpected email from Isabel. Not a text, which had been her preferred method of communication, but a formal email with a subject line that read simply, "Conversation." My finger hovered over the delete button, but curiosity won out. The email was longer than any communication I'd received from her in years, and its tone was notably different from her previous messages. She wrote that she'd been doing some thinking since the wedding, particularly after several mutual friends had asked why she hadn't attended her own sister's ceremony. Their questions had apparently forced her to articulate justifications that, upon reflection, didn't hold up well. She admitted that she'd been operating from a place of loyalty to our parents without really examining whether that loyalty was warranted or healthy. She didn't apologize for past behavior, but she acknowledged that the family dynamics we'd grown up with were more complicated than she'd wanted to admit. The email ended with a tentative invitation to meet for coffee, just the two of us, if I was open to it. No promises of reconciliation, no demands that I fix things with our parents, just a sister wondering if there might be a way forward for the two of them independent of the larger family conflict. I read the email 3 times, analyzing it for hidden agendas or manipulation tactics, but it seemed genuine in its uncertainty and openness. After discussing it with Marcus and Dr. Lewis, I agreed to meet Isabel at a neutral coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. The conversation was awkward at first, both of us overly polite and careful, dancing around the real issues. But gradually, as the initial tension eased, we began talking more honestly than we had in years. Isabel shared her own struggles with our parents' expectations, pressures I hadn't fully recognized because they manifested differently than mine. Where I'd been expected to be independent and self-sufficient, she'd been infantilized and treated as incapable, her dependence encouraged rather than discouraged. Neither situation was healthy, we realized together, just different manifestations of the same controlling dynamic. Our parents had assigned us roles early in life and then reinforced those roles through differential treatment that served their needs rather than supporting our growth. I'd been cast as the responsible one who didn't need support. She'd been cast as the sensitive one who needed constant rescue. Both scripts had been damaging in their own ways. That first coffee meeting led to occasional lunches, then to genuine conversations about our childhoods and the patterns we'd both internalized. Isabel began her own therapy journey, working through issues that her engagement to Trevor had brought into sharp focus. She eventually broke off that engagement, recognizing that she'd chosen him primarily because he fit our parents' idea of a successful match rather than because he actually made her happy or shared her values. My relationship with Isabel didn't magically transform into the sisterhood we'd never had, but it evolved into something more authentic than what had existed before. We could disagree without one of us having to be wrong. We could support each other without losing ourselves. We could acknowledge our parents' flaws without feeling like we were betraying them. It was imperfect and sometimes still complicated, but it was real. My parents remained distant, their silence a form of punishment they seemed to believe would eventually force my capitulation. Months became a year, then 2 years. Birthday cards arrived without personal messages, just their signatures and a check I never cashed. Holiday invitations came through Isabel with the caveat that my attendance would require an apology and acknowledgement that I'd been wrong. I declined each time, sad but certain in my boundaries. What surprised me most during this extended estrangement was how much my life improved without the constant undercurrent of their judgment and disappointment. My teaching flourished as I channeled energy previously spent managing family dynamics into developing innovative programs for my students. Marcus and I bought a small house in a diverse neighborhood with excellent public schools, exactly as we'd envisioned. We began the process of becoming foster parents, opening our home to children who needed temporary stability while their families worked toward reunification. James and Caroline Wellington became the parental figures I'd always needed. They called regularly just to check in, not because they wanted something but because they genuinely cared about our lives. They celebrated my small victories at work with the same enthusiasm they showed for Marcus's accomplishments. They treated me as a full member of their family, no conditions or comparisons required. Their relationship modeled what healthy parental love looked like, making it impossible to unsee the dysfunction in my own family of origin. Our first foster placement arrived on a rainy November evening, an 8-year-old girl named Destiny whose mother was in rehab working hard to get her life together. Destiny came with a trash bag of belongings, a defensive attitude, and test scores showing she was 2 grade levels behind in reading. Over the 6 months she stayed with us, I watched her transform as consistent care, clear expectations, and genuine affection worked their quiet magic. When she returned to her mother, now sober and stable, Destiny could read at grade level and had begun to trust that adults could be reliable. Fostering brought its own challenges and heartbreaks, but it also clarified something essential. The family you create through intentional choice and commitment can be just as valid and meaningful as the family you're born into, sometimes more so. Destiny stayed in touch, sending us drawings and school reports. Her mother called occasionally to update us on their progress and to thank us for the foundation we'd helped build. These connections, chosen and nurtured rather than assumed and taken for granted, became the fabric of a life that felt purposeful and rich. 3 years after my wedding, my father had a heart attack. Not fatal, but serious enough to require surgery and significant recovery time. Isabel called to tell me, her voice shaking with fear and the weight of being the only daughter physically and emotionally available to our parents during a crisis. I drove to the hospital immediately, not because our relationship had healed but because some things transcend unresolved conflict. My mother looked up when I entered the waiting room, her face haggard with worry and exhaustion. For a moment, I thought she might send me away or launch into recriminations about my absence from their lives. Instead, she simply said, "He's in surgery. They think he'll be okay." I sat down across from her and Isabel, and we waited together in silence punctuated by occasional updates from surgical staff. When my father was finally moved to recovery, I visited his room briefly. He looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in his hospital gown with various monitors tracking his vital signs. "Elena," he said when he saw me, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed an hour earlier. "You came." "Of course I came," I replied. "I'm still your daughter, even if our relationship is complicated." He nodded slowly, whether in acknowledgement or simply because he was too weak to do more, I couldn't tell. "I've had a lot of time to think," he said after a long pause. "Lying here, facing mortality, puts things in perspective." He closed his eyes briefly before continuing. "I'm not ready to say everything that probably needs to be said. But I wanted you to know that I'm glad you're here." It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It wasn't a promise of changed behavior or genuine reconciliation. But it was something, a small crack in the defensive wall my parents had maintained for 3 years. I took it for what it was, not demanding more than he could give in that moment, not minimizing my own needs to accommodate his limitations. Over the following weeks as my father recovered, I visited regularly but maintained clear boundaries. I helped coordinate his care and provided support during a difficult time, but I didn't pretend our relationship was healed or that the past had been erased. My mother and I achieved a careful détente, speaking when necessary about practical matters while avoiding topics that would inevitably lead to conflict. Gradually, awkwardly, we found a new equilibrium. My parents would never be the parents I'd needed growing up. They would probably never fully acknowledge the harm caused by years of differential treatment and withheld support. But they could be people I had a limited, boundaried relationship with, one that didn't require me to sacrifice my well-being or self-respect. 5 years after the engagement party that had catalyzed everything, Marcus and I hosted Thanksgiving at our house. Isabel came with her new partner, a social worker she'd met through a volunteer program she'd joined after ending her engagement to Trevor. Uncle Peter and his family attended. Caroline and James drove up from their new retirement home in San Diego. And somewhat surprisingly, my parents accepted the invitation, their first visit to our home since we'd purchased it. The gathering wasn't perfect. My mother made a few comments about our modest furniture that carried undertones of judgment. My father seemed uncomfortable with how hands-on Marcus and I were with parenting our current foster placement, a 5-year-old boy named Christopher. But they also brought a hostess gift and thanked us sincerely for including them. They asked questions about Christopher's story with what seemed like genuine interest. They didn't criticize or compare or undermine. As I watched my chosen and biological families mingling in our living room, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. The pain of that initial confrontation. The difficulty of maintaining boundaries against intense pressure. The grief of missing parents who were physically present but emotionally unavailable. The slow building of a life based on my own values rather than others' expectations. The unexpected allies and genuine family I'd found in places I hadn't anticipated. My sapphire engagement ring caught the light as I passed appetizers, its deep blue stone no more or less valuable than it had been when Marcus first placed it on my finger. But its meaning had deepened, expanded to encompass everything it had come to represent. Not just loyalty and wisdom and truth between partners, but the courage to define worth by your own measures rather than accepting others' narrow definitions. The strength to walk away from relationships that diminish you, even when walking away feels impossible. The faith that choosing authenticity over approval will ultimately lead to a richer, more meaningful life. James caught my eye from across the room and raised his glass slightly in a private toast. I smiled back, grateful once again for the man who had stood up when standing up mattered, who had spoken truth when everyone else was content with comfortable lies, who had seen value where others saw only deficit. His words at that disastrous engagement party had been a catalyst, but the real work of transformation had been mine to do. The boundaries were mine to establish and maintain. The life was mine to build. The worth was mine to claim. As dinner concluded and guests began gathering coats and saying goodbyes, my mother approached me in the kitchen where I was packaging leftovers. "This was nice," she said carefully. "Your home is lovely. Different than I would have chosen, but I can see it suits you." It was perhaps the closest she would ever come to admitting that her values weren't universal truths, that different choices could be equally valid. "Thank you for coming," I replied. "It means something that you made the effort." She nodded, then hesitated before adding, "That ring Marcus gave you. The sapphire. It does suit you better than a diamond would have." She didn't meet my eyes, but I heard what she wasn't quite saying beneath the words. An acknowledgement, however indirect, that her judgment had been wrong and hurtful. "I've always loved it," I said simply, not requiring more from her than she could give. As the door closed behind the last guest, Marcus pulled me close in our suddenly quiet house. "That went better than I expected," he said. "It did," I agreed. "Not perfect, but real. And real is all I've ever actually wanted." Christopher emerged from his room where he'd been playing with new toys my parents had brought, a gesture that had surprised and touched me. "Is it bedtime yet?" he asked, his small hand finding mine with the easy trust of a child who'd learned he was safe here. "Almost," I told him. "Let's read a story first." As we settled onto the couch with Christopher between us and a worn picture book open on our laps, I thought about the family I'd been born into and the family I'd created. Both were part of my story now, neither one complete or perfect, both necessary for understanding who I'd become. The journey from that painful engagement party to this peaceful evening had required more courage than I'd known I possessed. But every difficult conversation, every maintained boundary, every choice to prioritize authenticity over approval had built toward this moment. A moment of genuine contentment in a life that reflected my deepest values. A moment of chosen family gathered around shared purpose rather than obligation. A moment of knowing, with absolute certainty, that the ring on my finger represented something infinitely more precious than carats or cost. It represented the truth that real worth comes from living authentically, loving generously, and having the courage to define success on your own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.